Good morning. I hope we all excuse me. I hope we are all enjoying and not endangered by the most recent snow and the ice situation they're in. So today we're going to talk about the changing definition of civilization and what historiography is. Now I know I've introduced you all to the concept of historiography, but this particular topic becomes really relevant with the question about what and how we define civilizations and how we determine their success, as it were, and so forth. Because for a very long time, there was a very static definition of what a civilization was. But then there was the discovery in Peru of the Caral Supe people, or Norte Chico, depending. There are two different names, but it's the same group of people who existed at the same time that the other, what we refer to as traditional ancient civilizations did, but they did everything very backwards. So today we're going to talk about that and how the discovery of this society literally changed the way we tell the story of history and the way we define civilizations. All right, so what is a civilization? Well, since the 1800s, civilizations were believed to be formed the same way. And this is the way that most of you approached it, that people discovered how to grow plants, they created surplus food, they had more children, they settled down into small communities that eventually grew larger and larger and more organized. Or, as Harari would put it, they developed hierarchies and social structures. The larger the population, the more surplus, and thus the more organization needed. This would in turn lead to political structures, religious structures, social hierarchies, gender hierarchies, writing developed for record keeping, and laws developed to keep order. So this is basically your standard template for how civilizations were created. This is based effectively on the studies of the cultures that we consider to be the first civilizations: Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, and looking at the way they did things. When you read the chapters about them, you'll be looking at the approaches they took to agriculture, the weather patterns that helped them with that, that sort of thing. But effectively, this is how we defined for a very long time what a civilization was. All cultures came from these four bases, effectively: Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China. And if you are of Western descent, as in you came from the Western Europe, and the people from there who came to inhabit the Western Hemisphere and came to control and dominate it, then for the most part you view your historical culture as deriving from Mesopotamia. Western or European history, again, from the U.S., define it as coming from, again, Mesopotamia, maybe some Egyptian thrown in there, but for the most part, Mesopotamia. We try throughout all of this to connect history to the present, which is part of why we're bringing this up. But U.S. history, the history that most relates to us, until the 1960s and 70s, was based in the traditional interpretation of history from Western Europe, which places the history of Mesopotamia at its core. This is the history that gives us, if you were taking a Western Civ class as opposed to a world history class, you would be starting in Mesopotamia, you would be going through Judaism, you would go through the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and you would literally trace the history of Western Europe from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire through what is referred to as the period of great disorganization, or the theoretical Dark Ages, into the medieval period, the Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, colonization of the Western Hemisphere, and the rise of Europe because of that colonization into world prominence. And you would connect U.S. history to that, of course, through that colonization and the often violent dominance of the Western Hemisphere by the Europeans. So that's where you would get to. It's also the history that justifies European colonization of the Western Hemisphere, India, China, Southeast Asia, and the South Pacific starting in the 1500s. It's a history that developed in the 1700s to justify colonization, racism, sexism, nationalism, and many of the other ideologies that still exist today. So where I'm going with this is that this has been the traditional view. But it begins to change in the 60s and 70s. And that is primarily because of the civil rights movements in the United States and in Western Europe, and the and the desire of many people to trace their own personal histories or the histories of their respective people, as opposed to that of Western Europe and Western culture. Part of what helped that along was the discovery of Caral Supe, also known as Caral or Norte Chico. Some of you use the phrase Carolians in your responses to talk about these peoples. This ancient society in South America, one that can be dated literally to existing at the same time as the ancient Egyptians, challenges the traditional interpretation of civilizations because they did everything completely differently. It challenges the idea that civilizations have to develop along a similar path, from agriculture to urbanization to writing to empire, because these people did all of this differently. They did not develop agriculture first, which is very key to understanding them and why they are important. They subsisted for a very long time on fishing and cultivating sea creatures. And what this effectively means is that they don't do it the way everybody else does. They settled down, they built big, monolithic cities with religious buildings, religious architecture. And they did this by literally subsisting on fish. When they did decide to grow product for consumption, their biggest commodity was not food, it was cotton. They do, as many of you know, develop some foods agriculturally. They bring in corn from Mesoamerica. They do squash and beans. And just these are literally the foundation of almost all Western Hemisphere cultures and peoples, what are called the Three Sisters: corn, squash, and beans. And they add them to their diet, but they are still subsisting primarily on fish. And that's why cotton's important, because cotton becomes what they need in order to catch the fish. Their main city, insofar as we know, is inland from the sea, yet not near a river, which means they weren't looking at agriculture at the point in time that it was built. When agriculture does come, it's because they figured out how to irrigate, how to move water to where they need it. They had extensive trade, as demonstrated by the fact that they brought in corn from Mesoamerica. And it's significant because it was not easy to move goods from the Andean plains to and from Central America, because you have that one tiny little isthmus there at Panama, where the Panama Canal is located. It wasn't there then, obviously, but that is the only way to move, the only little place to get between Central America and South America. They did not develop a writing system that we can understand as of yet, or that we found as of yet, but we do know that they laid the foundation for something the Incans would have when the Europeans arrived there in the 1500s, and that is the quipu system. And the belief is that this was used as a mechanism for accounting, for keeping track of goods. It may well, though, have been another method of communication that we still don't understand. The Incas were using it, but they did not share the secret with the Spanish who conquered them. This form of record keeping and some of the religious beliefs that were developed by the people of Caral, such as the winged serpent god, will continue on as the base of almost all South American and to a certain extent Central American societies, even into the 15, 16, and 1700s. They do not appear to have had any defensive structures in their cities. So far, archaeologists have found no weapons, which leads us to believe that their culture, which appears to be pretty extensive, was based on trade, not on conquering other peoples. And this is particularly significant because if you look at the history of every other society that developed around this time, making war becomes foundational because cultures wanted to acquire more land and they wanted to acquire more slaves to work that land. So they conquered the peoples around them and then extended outward to do that. Maize, which was domesticated over tens of thousands of years in Central America because it took a very long time to cultivate it and turn it from literally the grass that it was into the corn we recognize today, arrived in Caral around 1600 BCE. All right. So where we get to historiography with this is that the civilization of Caral forced historians and archaeologists and anthropologists and all those people who study the past to re-examine the definition of civilization and to reconsider what I've been referring to as the symptoms of civilizations, as this civilization in the Western Hemisphere is very different in its origins, its foundations, and its expectations than anything that developed in Eurasia. Many of you told me that it was very different because it developed alone. And I want to remind you that all civilizations initially develop alone and without external influence. When we talk about the Mesopotamians, we talk about the first city, and the people therein, who then expanded outward and conquered more peoples and territory, which created Sumer, the Sumerians, and then later the Babylonians would take over that area, and it's just literally the same land, just the people who come into it are expanding their own empires and taking that land in. That's when the influence starts. But until the point that they're conquered, they're still pretty much themselves. The same thing is true with the people of Caral. They were alone. There just wasn't another civilization that we know of yet near them with whom they competed. So how do we define success? And this is a big part of what I was trying to get you to with the question. If you're judging today's societies by longevity, then we today all fail. The U.S. is not yet 300 years old. We're coming up on our 250th anniversary in theory. The EU is less than 50 years old. The Russian Federation is less than 50 years old. Even communist China is less than 100 years old. It wasn't founded, well, I guess it's about 100 years old now because it was founded in the 1920s. You could, however, argue that it is a continuation of the society that developed in the ancient era, which I've done. China and Egypt are the two continuous societies. Iran or Persia would be another one, even though the Persians come along at the time of you could call the Persians an ancient civilization, but they developed literally from conquering the Babylonians. So if we judge success by the standard of living of the average person, then in today's world, the best standards of living are the US, the EU, and China, where the majority of the population at present have access to medical care, varieties of food, homes, clean water, the base necessities of life. In the past, that would have applied to China, It would have applied to the Harappans. It would have applied to the people of Caral Supe, to the Mesopotamians, pretty much all of the early first civilizations for most of their existence. Not all of it, because as they go into decline, those things begin to diminish, which is part of why they fail. They go away. What I wanted to do with this was to make you think about success, though, and how we define it, and to consider your own personal standard for what that means, because it's very important that you consider this when we start talking. That's why defining these terms is so important, because we all have different ways that we get to a definition when it comes to the most alike and the least alike. Most of you did discuss the fact that Caral Supe is the least like any of the others, and that's true because it does everything backwards. It settles down, then does agriculture. It doesn't develop writing that we recognize as writing. One could argue, if we ever figure out the secret of the Quipu, that it may be a means of communication as well. All of them had agriculture and polytheism at some point in time. Most of them have some form of pyramids. Egypt had pyramids, Caral Supe had pyramids, Mesopotamia had ziggurats, which are a variation of a pyramid. The Harappans had stupas, which were a variation of the pyramids. Almost all of them have some large monolithic structure that is in some way smaller at the top than at the bottom. All had some form of nonverbal communication. Cuneiform hieroglyphs, phonogrammic seals, quipu. They had some method for doing this, but again, not all of it was in writing. The Harappans were had mathematically concise stones, buildings, jewelry. Their lapis lazuli beads were very uniform. China had the mandate of history to support the ruling dynasty, and it goes on to become the method by which they replace those dynasties over time. And Israel develops monotheism, which makes it very different from the other societies. So how do you define success? Is it longevity? If so, Egypt and China, because they're still here today. Is it trade? The Harappans traded with the Mesopotamians and others. The Chinese built canals for trade between rivers. The Caral Supe traded shellfish for cotton, and as we know, they traded as far away as Mesoamerica. Is it military might? In which case the Mesopotamians conquered constantly. That was my example with the Sumer, Babylonia, later Persia definition. When you look at your news feed, you're going to see articles often about the best places to live. But before you start looking at those, you think about how journalists are defining that. Is it based on how the prices of living in those areas compare with the standard of living? Is it based on happiness of the people living there, which we refer to as quality of life? Or is it based on how long that place has existed? Would you not apply those same standards that we use for today to societies in the past? So think about that when you think about the question of which societies are best and why. These are excerpts from Harari that I think are particularly interesting and useful in the course of this discussion. One of history's few iron laws is that luxuries tend to become necessities and to spawn new obligations. And this is part of how he gets to why agriculture wins out, that over time people change from realizing that they have a benefit to expecting to have that all the time. As an example, none of you were born in the days when we didn't have cell phones, and yet you all now assume that and society does as well, that you must have one. So back in the pre-2000s, having a cell phone of any kind was a luxury. Now it is effectively a necessity. The agricultural revolution made the future far more important than it had ever been. Farmers must always keep the future in mind and must work in its service. So what this effectively means is that hunter-gatherers lived day to day. They didn't worry about the future. They had the food they needed. They might worry about winters. They might stay in warmer areas where they could hunt and gather year-round. But with the agricultural revolution, they have to start planning for the future because they have to figure out how to keep food so that it doesn't go bad before they need it, how to store it, And then they have to think about the crop yield each year so that they have enough food to get them through the winter months. Everywhere, rulers and elites sprang up, living off the peasants' surplus food and leaving them with only a bare subsistence. And this appears to apply across the board. You get hierarchy in Caral Supe the same way you do everywhere else. The extra that the farmers produced fed the tiny minority of elites, kings, government officials, soldiers, priests, artists, and thinkers who fill the history books. History is something that very few people have been doing while everyone else was plowing fields and carrying water buckets. We're going to start very soon talking about the origination of history itself, where history starts. Most of us agree that it literally starts in China, where the writing of history became something that justified the dynasty that had control. We'll talk about that when we get to that in just a few minutes, or in a few days, sorry. But effectively, it is something that is written by a very few, because very few could read and write. So the keeping of history is something done by elites. And as the adage goes, the winners write the history. So that's something to contemplate as we go through this. What do we know about these societies? How do we know it? And who wrote it down? Cooperation sounds very altruistic, but is not always voluntary and seldom egalitarian. Most human cooperation networks have been geared towards oppression and exploitation. Slavery starts with the first civilizations because people got tired of being peasants all the time. So it was better to have slaves to do the really hard work of producing food. Imagined orders are based on shared myths, the rise of organized religion. And quite often religion justifies the creation of hierarchy. However, an imagined order cannot be sustained by violence alone. It requires some true believers as well. And one of the things we find, particularly in this period of polytheistic religions, is that the winners could force their religions on the people they conquer, but quite often those people turn to them because they think that the winners have a stronger god than their gods. Writing itself developed because of the need for numbers. So literally the first writing systems were accounting systems. Being able to keep up with writing or records led to the creation of bureaucracy, which is true. And all of these early societies developed bureaucracy for tax purposes, if nothing else, but then from that for other purposes. Imagined orders created hierarchies, most of which are based on imagined differences. And we saw that already in the creation of Hammurabi's Code, where depending on who you are in the society, how elite you are, the laws apply differently. Hierarchies, though, do serve an important function. They enable complete strangers to know how to treat one another without wasting the time and energy needed to become personally acquainted. And for Harari, this is moving into the area of discussing how societies become larger and larger. One of the reasons civilizations are different is because the imagined orders and hierarchies created by them are different. In most cases, the hierarchy originated as a result of a set of accidental historical circumstances and was then perpetuated and refined over many generations as different groups developed vested interests in it, or as wealth accumulated, developed, and different groups became more involved in either the production of that wealth or the keeping of that wealth. This is one of my favorite phrases from him. Biology enables, culture forbids. Biology is willing to tolerate a very wide spectrum of possibilities. It's culture that obliges people to realize some possibilities while forbidding others. Think about that. I think it's very significant in that it's very much a matter of the difference between biology and society. Most of the laws, norms, rights, and obligations that define manhood and womanhood reflect human imagination more than biological reality. And that's very true. If you think about the idea that there are things that men can do and women can't, that's actually cultural. That's not biological. It is far more likely that even though the precise definition of man and woman varies between cultures, there is some universal biological reason why almost all cultures valued manhood over womanhood. We do not know what this reason is. There are plenty of theories. None of them are convincing. And it's part of why I had you looking at or comparing the way life is between hunter-gatherers and settled peoples. In hunter-gatherer societies, they are far more egalitarian between the genders. In settled societies, they are much more distinct. The roles are much more enforced. All right, there's a really good video here. This explains how the discovery of Caral Supe revolutionized the teaching of world history. I will actually put that in the email that accompanies this video so that you can have access to it. That is my works cited, as it should look in your works cited if you're using any of these, and many of you are. All right, so that was mostly what I wanted to say about Caral Supe and the comparison of these older civilizations. One of you didn't actually do Caral Supe, but this is going to be important to you because your quiz is going to cover this. That would be one of my North Georgia classes, not one of my GGC classes. Those of you at GGC, you'll start having a quiz next week, or the option for quizzes next week. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to end this video. Depending on which school you're at, there will be other instructions for what you're doing in the email that will accompany this video. So please read those instructions so that you know what you are doing for this week. Enjoy today, and I will hopefully see all of you on Wednesday.